will have to include new taxes. Tomorrow, former Presidents Carter and Ford will give their opinions to Mr. Bush on the deficit and other transition issues. Mr. Bush also meets tomorrow with David Packard, who headed a highly regarded commission on Pentagon reform. Packard has been advising the vice president on military spending and on candidates for the critical post of defense secretary. Linda Tyra, CBS News, Washington.
Well, the voters may have read the vice president's lips when he said no new taxes, but like the General Accounting Office, they don't believe him. 2/3 of Americans, including more than half of those who voted for George Bush, think that he will raise taxes. Of more than 1,600 people interviewed by CBS News and the New York Times the week after the election, half have a favorable impression of Mr. Bush, but expect him to be only an average president. It's Election Day in Canada tomorrow, and the big issue is the free trade agreement with the United States. Eric Engberg has this Election Eve outlook from Toronto.
As the leaders of Canada's three major parties made their last-minute pitches to an unusually attentive electorate, the latest poll showed the Conservatives of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney moving into a clear lead, boosting the hopes of U.S. officials that Mulroney can win an outright majority and force through the deal to end most trade barriers between the two nations.
The Canadian election laws make it easier to vote than in the U.S., and Canadians take their civic duties very seriously. Turnout in the U.S. election was under 50%. Tomorrow, more than 85% of the eligible voters in Canada are expected to go to the polls.
The opposition Liberals of John Turner had banked everything on an appeal to Canadian nationalism, arguing the trade agreement would enable U.S. interests to take over their country.
We will not allow Mr. Mulroney to trade our birthright as a nation.
Conservatives answered the agreement was just another step in economic cooperation.
We're not just your biggest supplier, but we're your biggest customer. And it's just an opportunity to show the world how to improve the rules governing that kind of trade.
The race has been unusually bitter by Canadian standards, as the free trade issue touched a nerve with a country which views itself as already being the kinder, gentler nation that George Bush held out as a goal for America to strive toward. Eric Engberg, CBS News, Toronto.
Tropical storm Keith is over western Cuba tonight. Forecasters expect Keith to intensify, possibly reaching hurricane strength tomorrow, and head for southwestern Florida. Still ahead on the CBS Sunday Night News, congressmen whose love for public service began in the Peace Corps honor the memory of its founder, John F. Kennedy. Palestinian state. Egypt's announcement followed a direct Israeli appeal to deny recognition. The cost of gasoline could go lower. It hinges on what happens this week at a meeting in Vienna of the OPEC oil ministers. Bill McLaughlin in London has the outlook.
Tomorrow, OPEC's oil ministers gather in formal session for what's being called a make-or-break meeting. If the ministers cannot reach agreement, experts say, what will break is the price of oil. The problem is cheating. OPEC members are supposed to voluntarily cut back on production in order to raise the price of oil. Petroleum giants like Saudi Arabia, the free world's biggest producer, want prices, now hovering at around $12 a barrel, pushed higher. But countries like Iran and Iraq, also major oil producers, need as much money as they can get from their oil production. They've just agreed to a ceasefire in their 8-year-long war, and Iraq especially is cheating to pay off its huge war debt.
Iraq is now free to increase its production quite substantially, and we expect something like another 1 million barrels a day next year.
The Iran-Iraq war helped keep pump prices at their lowest in years. Good news for the American motorist. And those prices could go lower still if there's no agreement this week in Vienna. Saudi Arabia has threatened to produce as much oil as it can and pour it, along with its massive oil reserves, onto the open market. If that happens, experts say, oil prices could be cut in half. Bill McLaughlin, CBS News, London.
A new reference book compares President Reagan's support of Star Wars and stealth technologies to Adolf Hitler's belief in so-called wonder weapons. The noted British defense publication Jane's suggests the U.S. weapons plans might be as unrealistic as Hitler's.
In the village of...
Said today she hopes the Corps can grow from 6,000 to 10,000 in the next few years. She spoke at a ceremony in Boston where more than 300 former volunteers gathered at the Kennedy Library to celebrate the opening of a Peace Corps archives for photographs and diaries. Tomorrow, former Peace Corps volunteers will commemorate the program as President Kennedy's living legacy, beginning a vigil in the Capitol Rotunda with readings from the journals they kept when they served overseas. Among the more than 130,000 Americans who have served in the Peace Corps since 1961 are 6 current members of Congress who will take part in the ceremony.
You had President Kennedy call a generation into public service, and I was in junior high school at the time, but I felt at the very moment he discussed the Peace Corps and said, you should serve this world, that's what I wanted to do.
Congressman Christopher Shays and his wife Betsy spent 2 years in the Peace Corps as teachers in Fiji and say that the experience has had a lasting effect.
To spend 2 years of your life where you are really being of service sets a tremendous tone on what you do with the rest of your life.
Tony Hall, who has served in the House for 10 years, taught English to people in rural Thailand, and he still remembers what he learned.
It got me away from being centered in myself and being extremely selfish. And it got me to focus on other people and other land, to give a little bit, something I was not used to reach out, to help our neighbors.
For these former volunteers, as for thousands of others, the memory of their voluntary service continues to shape their lives many years later.
I realize that the third world is very important to us, and we do need to assist these countries.
Hall says his Peace Corps experience influences the kind of causes in which he's now involved.
With poor people and needy people, I spent a lot of time on those kind of issues, and I think it goes directly back. I can see it goes directly back to the Peace Corps experience.
Tuesday, it will be 25 years since President John F. Kennedy was felled by an assassin's bullets. Bruce Morton remembers his presidency.
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace.
He was an inspirational politician. He tried to activate a country that he thought had been asleep for a while. So I think the main thing that he did was to get people alive, get them awake, get them moving.
He did it in speeches, of course, but he and his whole family got us moving because we saw them moving every day on our television screens.
If you just want to sit down and list achievements, you know, there aren't that many, I think, that rank that high for the Kennedy administration.
Failure at the Bay of Pigs, the CIA-trained invasion force beaten back, the United States, its sponsor, forced to pay ransom to get its freedom fighters back.
There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan.
When the Berlin Wall went up, Kennedy was cautious, but West Berlin remained free and gave him a hero's welcome.
There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin.
The Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba, Nikita Khrushchev perhaps thinking he could outbluff the young American. The world those tense days walked about as close to nuclear war as it ever has. But in the end, the missiles left and Americans breathed easily again.
And in America, there was so much ferment, so much movement at that time. There was a time when a lot of individuals felt a sense of public goals. That era was one that will be forever attached to somehow the symbolism of this young couple coming on the stage at that time.
We can't see who has been hit, if anybody's been hit, but apparently something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong.
And then he died.
The President of the United States is dead.
If he had lived, he would be 71 now. But because he died, we see him ever young, with laughing children, faces full of tomorrows. Because he died, we see the once and future king, Arthur in Camelot.
That's the CBS Sunday Night News. I'm Bill Plant. See you on the White House beat. Good night.
I'm Harry Smith.
And I'm Kathleen Sullivan. Beginning tomorrow, Felicia Rashad, author Nora Ephron, and the Smothers Brothers
talk turkey with their Thanksgiving recipes on CBS This Morning.
This is CBS.